You know that bit when you start a relationship and everything's just so good? You're like, this person is brilliant. They are off the hook. Fantastic. That is how I felt about the Samsung 980 Pro when it was first launched at the tail end of 2020, like October, sort of September, late September it was launched out time. And I was genuinely excited. It was the first real 7,000 megabytes per second SSD that you could get commercial. And I was like, oh my God, I must have you. And I paid well over the odds for a 250 gig drive. And then over time, I got a bit comfortable. I just thought, yeah, well, it's good, but there's other 7,000 meg SSDs out there, and this is good and that, but it's not as special anymore. And things move forward, and I started looking at other SSDs, and then eventually I sort of parted ways with the Samsung 980 SSD, and I started looking at other SSDs, and then I kind of forgot about the Samsung because other 7,000 SSDs were on the market, and then all of a sudden I bumped into the Samsung 980 again. I was just out minding my own business, with other SSDs, and then boom, it arrived back on the scene, and my God, it got my attention again. This is the Samsung 980 with a heatsink on. They finally did it. So today's video, we are going to return to the 980 Pro. We want to see whether it's as good as we remember. We want to see if its performance still stands up so long after its initial release, because it's the same SSD, the same controller, new firmware updates, but with a heatsink. And we want to see how it compares with other SSDs. We want to see how it compares on our test machine, and ultimately help you decide whether it still deserves your data in 2022. Run that intro. Now, that weirdly dramatic intro aside, let's really kind of like streamline things down a little bit. The Samsung 980 Pro was indeed one of the first PCIe Gen 4 7,000 megabytes per second SSDs in the market. PCIe Gen 4 SSDs have been around. I think it was Seagate and their Phison E16 partnership, the E16 controller from Phison. They were kind of one of the earliest SSDs on the market that cracked the 5,500 mark. But it was Samsung and the WD Black, that we're also going to talk about in this video, that were first kind of offer it to prosumers and indeed, average man on the street SSDs that could reach that performance value. But it was always weird, very early doors, that the Samsung, when it was launched, didn't have a first-party heatsink. It heavily relied on you getting your own heatsink. There we go. This is kind of that, of all the $10 heatsinks that I've ever used, this is the one that on the channel I recommend a lot. This is the Eluting. It's not out of this world, but unlike a lot of prosumer heatsinks on the market, again, like that fat PC heatsink one from Sabrent, this is $25. It does a great job and it's excellent value for money. And if you're a PC user and you're going to use an NVMe SSD, you get yourself a heatsink. And given that the Samsung, when it was launched, didn't have a heatsink, people were using the Alsaka or Alsaka, whatever its pronunciation of that, and a few other heatsinks as well. And while that SSD was on the market, other SSDs started to arrive with first-party heatsinks. And one of the most formidable and biggest comparable, as mentioned, was the WD Black, an SSD we're going to compare against a lot in this video. It had a heatsink included, but they really did charge through the nose. It was one of the best heatsinks on the market. I would argue it's been slightly superseded and outdone in recent months by a few brands, but still nonetheless, as a package, this is still probably pretty unbeatable. And much like the Samsung that we're talking about in today's kind of review, because this isn't the first time we talked about this SSD on the channel, I will say that because these two SSDs have been in the market for so long, the result has been that their prices are some of the best out there for a 7,000 megs SSD. Now, whether you think that's a good thing, because you're obviously looking for an SSD to upgrade your PS5, to upgrade your gaming PC rig, I get that, and indeed there are NAS systems starting to adopt PCIe Gen 4 as well. Just because it's the cheapest doesn't make it the best. So in today's video, as mentioned, we're reviewing it. We're going to be retesting it again. We've also got results in the written article linked in the description where we compare it against the very same SSD with an Eluting heatsink and not the official heatsink from Samsung, so do check that out. But we want to find out today, is this still worth your money in 2022? So let's get inside. I've already opened this up several times, hence why the box looks a bit bashed around. If you buy it, it won't look like that. We've got the information on the instructions, first time setup, and the warranty. It's still got the 5-year warranty. That includes the heatsink, but why would you worry about that? It's got the box inside, and indeed, there is our SSD. Now, the first thing that strikes me about this is one of the most streamlined heatsinks on the market, closely rivaled by the Seagate Firecuda heatsink. This is a solid single piece. It's a full surround all the way around the device. Very subtle ventilation all the way through. When you look at it top down, you can't really see it, but there it is at the top. The heat inside, the heat dissipation alongside the aluminium top area there. It has one fleshed out foam pad at the top, and then it has individual panels on the inside that cover the controller and the memory there. There's a little bit less on the NAND components because they don't mind getting a bit warm. Now, as a quick reminder, this SSD is a PCIe Gen 4x4 SSD. It takes advantage of NVMe revision 1.3C, so not 1.4 like a lot of the SSDs that have come in the interim. There has been numerous updates in the firmware for this SSD over time. I will say that during my testing, I apologise if I refer to the NAND inside as MLC, not TLC. Again, I always get this mixed up with another SSD, so if I do that during this video, I apologise. It takes advantage of the ELPIS or Ellipsis controller. It's an in-house controller SSD, and again, in-house controller SSDs generally mean you get better IOPS. I've noticed that from Crucial to WD to Samsung. In-house controllers seem to get the very best output of these SSDs in terms of controller, in terms of IOPS. And in this case, this does push that 1 million mark in terms of IOPS. Even 14-15 months since its initial release, it's still one of less than 10 SSDs that can provide 1 million IOPS at that 1 TB level there. It's not a lot of SSDs in the market that do that. Now, this is slightly offset with the read and write. As I've mentioned numerous times, at 1 TB, this SSD should, in the right PC, and that's what I'm talking like some high-end Ryzen, we're not going to be testing it in a Ryzen, it should crack 7,000 megabytes per second sequential read. However, it's the write where things go down a little bit. With the 1 TB model we've got here, promoting 5,000 megabytes per second sequential write. Now, that's still a great number, but there are SSDs at this same level, this same price, that can push out 6,000, 6,500, and in some cases, at the 2 TB level, 6,800 megabytes per second sequential write. Now, if you're a gamer, you're not going to use a lot of sequential write. You might be doing some streaming, maybe capturing some footage for content creation. But unless you are a full-on content creator in full time, or a 4K or even 8K video editor, you're not really going to have to worry too much about write. So although the write performance of this SSD since its launch has been somewhat overshadowed by other SSDs in the meantime, it's still pretty good in of itself and not an enormous deciding factor when going for it. If you do look at reviews and indeed re-reviews of this SSD from big websites like Tweaktown and Storage Review and Tom's Hardware and that, when they've returned to reviewing this SSD, there is a very consistent thread that you see there. Whether you are looking at some websites that will use PCMark, which is a great benchmark performance test software for overall different sample and test measurements, all of them show the same kind of results, with the SSD very rarely hitting and surpassing its reported maximums. And that's because its architecture, unlike a lot of modern SSDs that have been released in the last 3 to 6 months, the rest of hardware technology that surround PCIe Gen 4 M.2 NVMe has moved forward in a way that this SSD, such as the NVMe revision and stuff like that, has yet to do. Now, inside it does take advantage of 3D NAND, obviously VNAND, and that's TLC NAND as well. I hate seagulls. But on top of that, it also has, man alive, those seagulls are noisy today. When it comes to other review sites and this SSD, what you get is definitely confidence in its IOPS, definitely confidence in its file management and handling, but still, across all of the different review sites, whether it's with the Heatsink version or newer firmware revisions of this SSD being re-reviewed, you see that the performance still doesn't stack against those modern SSDs. The IOPS and responsive time, and indeed, when we go through our benchmark, I'm almost certain that when we test this, that heatsink is going to be bloody efficient, because I've looked at enough of them now to see a lot of the good from the bad in the build quality, but still, that read-write performance there is slightly letting this SSD down. But that is somewhat offset by the fact the price tag knocking around is a great deal more competitive than others. Even with the Heatsink version, it's only around $20 to $30 more expensive on sites like Newegg. Now, if we look at the WD Black, the Seagate Firecuda 530 and others, the Heatsink enabled versions of those SSDs are around $50 to even in some cases $70 more expensive. So if you're already going to go for this SSD, it is a no-brainer, console or PC user, to go for the Heatsink version anyway. Now, we've talked about IOPS, we've talked about throughput, but one thing we've not really talked about is durability, because that's another area where this SSD, I'm a little surprised that in the time since its first iteration without the heatsink and pre all those revisions of firmware, that we didn't see a little bit of improvement, and that's durability. Now, it's available with the heatsink currently in 1 and 2 TB forms, with that durability rated at 0.3 drive writes per day, or 600 or 1200 terabytes written respective to the 1 and 2 TB versions. Now, why is that important? Well, PCIe Gen 4 SSDs, particularly if you're going to be using them with that heavier write activity, durability is going to be a factor, because that enhanced performance means you're probably going to use it that lot more, and therefore durability may play its part down the line. PS5 users and PC gamers, you can not have to worry about this bit. You can check out for another 90 seconds or so. But those of you that deal with file editing may be surprised to know that 0.3 drive DWPD, although respectable, is actually a little lower than a lot of SSDs in the market right now. We're seeing a lot more 0.4, 0.5, all the way up to 0.7 drive writes per day in terms of durability. So I'm very, very surprised that within this drive's life, we didn't see a refresh or a reapproach to a lot of the architecture of the NAND inside that SSD there. It's still a great SSD for its price, but it'll be remiss of me not to highlight that durability being a pinch lower than a lot of the other ones out there. Now, durability only really comes in really if you're worried about the drive not lasting as long as the warranty, because it's got that 5 years as mentioned. But I think this is enough chitter chatter. Let's get this SSD into our test machine, run it through its paces, see how it compares against that WD Black, and ultimately decide whether not only is this heatsink version better than the non-heatsink version with that $10 heatsink inside, but also, is it still worth your data in 2022? Let's make our way to the test machine. Okay, so we've got the SSD back together and it's all screwed in, and we've put it inside my PC. We're going to be doing our testing here, and for the second half of this video we're going to be using some very specific bits of software. As you can see from the top right of the screen, there is our Samsung 980 Pro with heatsink. It's actually called that, I didn't call it that, and we have already mounted it as a volume. So if we make our way in to the machine, you'll see that the test machine we're utilizing today, as I kind of alluded to earlier in the video, we are using a Windows 10 Pro version. I've not upgraded to 11 because, much like the rest of you, I'm not 100% certain I trust it. It's an 11th Gen i5, and as you can see, it's 6 core. We've also got 16 gig of memory. So although this isn't the heavy hitting Ryzen that we've seen a lot of people testing, Ryzen 9s with GPU cards, this PC is still designed to be somewhat relatable for real world use. So hopefully a lot of the results you're going to see today, even if you're running a mid-range Windows PC, are what you should see. Also on the left hand side of the screen, it is worth talking just a tiny bit before we go into the results about how Samsung not only prices up that heatsink, but how it compares to the non-version. So that's the official page there. There are the specifications, all of the performance figures. We have updated this SSD as well to the latest version. As we can see here, moving to the left and the right, if we go down to the specifications, we're able to see that this version is much the same in terms of performance, still rating exactly the same build, same 3-bit MLC NAND there being utilised in multi-layer cells. All of that stacked between the two SSDs, very, very similar. So same controller, it is really just that heatsink. If we go down to the sequentials as well, remember we are looking at the 1 TB, so we can look at the 1 TB sequentials there, 7,000 over 5,000, and if we look at the sequentials once again, 7,000 over 5,000 once again. Even if you go over to Newegg, you're able to see that if you get the 1 TB without a heatsink, because it's been around longer, that price tag there noticeably lower. As you can see there at 229 down, that's obviously the recommended retail price there, has been put down to 179. That's pretty much the solid price. I've seen it knocking around maybe for about 169. It's regularly on sale. And if we go to Newegg for the heatsink version for 1 TB, you can see the price difference isn't actually too bad. We've seen this heatsink knocking around for about $30. And again, it's a much more compact heatsink than a number of the ones out there, and that's what we're using today. So don't think we're not also going to be looking at the temperature of this SSD as we run. You can see that the SSD been running for a short amount of time there, and as you can see all the way along it kicked off at 29C and currently sat, when I did some very preliminary formatting of the drive for this test, the highest it got was 34, and again that is with the onboard heatsink. So we're going to go back to those specifications there, and we're going to have a look at the test regimen that we're going to be utilising today. Actually, let's get rid of that temp test. And again, I am using OBS right now, which unfortunately will affect a lot of the result. That's why we turn off the screen recording and come back to it afterwards. I could use a capture card or use an external capture card, but that is currently in use for some PlayStation 5 content coming soon. The testing we're going to be running today, we are taking advantage of Crystal Disk. We're going to be doing 3 tests on that. We're also going to be running Atto Disk Benchmark with 3 tests on that. We're going to be doing SSD, again 3 tests on that. And of course, we're also going to be running AJA for some sustained activity there in a single rotation. And as you can see, we've added the 980 Pro with heatsink. That's it. That's all the tests. We're going to run all of these now. It's going to take about an hour. We're going to let the system sit idle for 1 minute between every test. And again, after we've done all of those tests, we're going to go through the result and of course compare it against some of the SSDs that we have tested previously. Almost certainly we're going to look at that WD Black with its own internal heatsink to see how these results compare. And of course we're going to return to those temperatures. So let's fast forward 1 hour to the completion of these tests and go through those results. Right, so we finished our testing and we've learned quite a few things. As I mentioned in the intro to this video, when the Samsung 980 Pro arrived on the scene, it was one of the earliest examples out there of 7,000 megabytes per second PCIe Gen 4 SSDs. Although it wasn't one of the first PCIe Gen 4 SSDs on the market, both this and the WD Black SN850 were the first to really put forward the idea of 7,000 megs. Now, as good as that sounds, what that means is, given this SSD is more than a year, maybe in a year and 2 or 3 months old inside, although it's had firmware updates, the result is that the performance we've seen today, although impressive in of itself, means that in traditional throughput stakes, the SSD maybe doesn't compare just as favourably as some of the PCIe4 SSDs that have occurred and arrived from different brands in the last 3 to 6 months. Now, looking at this heatsink version, as I stated earlier, it uses the same architecture both with and without that heatsink. Now, let's cut straight onto that heatsink first there. When we look at the temperature testing, this is the temperature that occurred all the way through our testing. When we were testing this SSD, each one of these increases in spikes and decreases is where each of the tests that we performed happened. Starting in the 30s and in the initial formatting of the drive going a little higher, we can see that it crept up to a maximum 51. It just dipped into the 50s there, whereas again these SSDs are designed to work well up to 70C. It should be said that's fine, but the idea is you want these SSDs to be working at their pinnacle at under 50C. So when it crept into 50 there, obviously this was when we were doing quite intensive testing. This is when we were doing our crystal disk and our AJA testing. The result was that it did creep up a little higher than we would have liked to have seen. Now, I mentioned earlier on that we would be comparing throughout this test with that of the WD Black, an SSD that arrived at the same time as this SSD. And one of the earliest things you can see when we compare these two and their graphs, very similar spike shape patterns, of course, because we run a very regular recurrent test pattern on these SSDs. But whereas on the WD it went into the 60s, it did still at least remain at just 51C, with that WD going into that 60 there. So it definitely, that new heatsink overall dissipated heat a great deal better than the WD. Now, moving away from the heatsink there, let's go into that performance. Remember, they stated that the performance of this 1 TB drive, and again we're going to look at the heatsink one just to be clear, that the heatsink of the 1 TB drive had a performance of sequential read at 7,000 megabytes per second and up to 5,000 megabytes per second. That's up to for both of them. Now, unfortunately, we weren't able to hit both those numbers. If we go for this on our 11th gen i5 6-core computer here, we can see that in our 3 tests that we performed earlier at 1 gig, 4 gig, and 16 gig, the highest we got was 6,700 or so megabytes per second sequential read. Remember, this is sequential. This wasn't using a high-end Ryzen processor that a lot of the top-end benchmarks for this architecture generally use. So we didn't think we'd hit 7,000. The write as well was just under 5,000 for each of them, and as we can see there, it was reported to have a sequential write of 5,000, so that's pretty darn close there. Again, we are seeing SSDs are arriving on the market in PCIe Gen 4 that can go higher than that. For example, the PNY that we tested, actually let's not look at that because that's a 2 TB drive. If we look at the Firecuda, one of the biggest kind of competitive examples of this kind of architecture, and we look at the 16 there, we can see that this SSD did get a higher write there, and a lot of that can be put down to that architecture that's developed in the almost 1 year time difference between the release of those SSDs. Now, if we keep talking about comparisons there, let's move back to that WD Black. Now, the WD Black that we reviewed there, let's have a look. WD Black there at 1 gig versus 1 gig, it still got a higher read, although write again was higher. But the real key thing I want you to take away, and again we'll look at all 3 of them, 5 versus that, and in each core test session it did go higher. What was particularly interesting between the 2 of them was that in real world testing, and that is our mixed performance level there, in some cases the Samsung overtook the WD. Not all, but certainly some. But one area where the Samsung again lived to type, all the the details were the same, was that IOPS there. Now IOPS, it was supposed to break 1 million in an ideal scenario. Once again, these are tests that have been performed with high-end Ryzen processors that, although obviously are exceedingly powerful with GPU support, they're not really applicable to most domestic users, hence our test machine. Now, in this case, the closest we got was around 950,000, which in of itself at 1 TB is still very respectable. But if we look at the WD Black, it was able to break the 1 million mark on the IOPS there of random 4K crystal disk IOPS. Broke 1 million in all 3 tests on that WD. We got real close here on the Samsung, not as close as I would have liked to have seen. Heat dissipation certainly is still doing its thing, and this SSD is still providing the same kind of results that similar testing of architecture like the one I've got in my test bench here that were done a year ago on other sites do still show. It's very similar and comparable. Now, stepping away from Crystal Disk, let's go into Atto. Now, with Atto here, we did 3 tests as mentioned previously, as you can see there on screen. Let's remove the Crystal Disk benchmark there. And all 3 here, we had it at 256 meg, so a quarter of a gig, 1 gig, and 4 gig. Now, the read there got to a nice respectable, it broke into the 6 gigabytes per second there. And again, we got 6.14 there. We got a little bit of a smattering down there. So again, on this SSD, we did start to see some of those larger file types maintain that high speed when generally a lot of other SSDs kind of peak at around the 512 KB mark. So it was nice to see that there, but still slightly lower than some of the SSDs that we've seen released in the last 3 to 6 months. Likewise, in the write department, we never really saw it leave the 6.5 gigabytes there at 6.5 and 6.4 recurrent on a number of write performance benches all the way through. Now, if we switch over to the IOPS, obviously we are looking at differing file sizes than we would have liked to have seen, but still the IOPS there were fairly respectable for the 256, 1 gig and 4 gig respective that we were looking at there. Once again, we're going to bring in our WD Black results there. And if we go between them, we can look at that the 1 gig file size there. So that's going to be the 1 gigs here in the middle together. And we can see between the two of them that the IOPS on this Samsung were notably higher all the way through on those IOPS from very early doors all the way up. And indeed, if we switch back onto the read-write performance there, we can see that at the 1 gig level, and if we look at read-write respectively between the two of them, let's bring that there, we can see that those numbers, although comparable, were clearly higher on the WD in terms of write and in terms of read. Same again. So again, this is something we're seeing in conventional read-writes. The Samsung, as good as it was at launch, still needs a little bit of a kick in the air, and maybe a newer version, if it was released, would address these. Being one of the first into the pack to release a 7000 meg SSD makes a lot of sense, and it is still one of the more the best value SSDs at the 7000 megabytes per second line that's available in the market right now. But you can't really ignore that there have been a lot of innovations and releases in SSDs in the 14 or 15 months since this original SSD was released. Now, if we move into the ASSD results, bring that up there on screen, and we ignore that black screen there because I accidentally opened the wrong benchmark. We can see there again ASSD a little bit more of an aggressive bench test here. We can see that it lived at the 5.3, 5.2, even 5.4 over here, 5,400 megabytes per second the sequential reads, and we can see a breakdown there of the individual test types. Again, we're going to go back into that WD Black. As we can see, if we look at the 1 gig there and we look at the conventional read-writes, once again, we did see the WD take the lead there. The Samsung 980 is a solid SSD with or without the heatsink there, but it would be remiss to ignore that difference there in performance on the same test machine side by side, with that WD just seemingly ruling the day overall. And that was a consistent trend, even when we went up to the largest file type here, the left-hand side of the screen there with the WD Black, both higher in read, but particularly high in write, and an overall score at every single tier here being higher on this WD at each turn. So as good as the scores are independent of themselves on the Samsung 980 Pro, and the fact that the Samsung 980 Pro is still sitting at one of the more affordable SSDs in the market, likely due to being in the market for a greater deal of time, there's still no ignoring that difference in price. And again, finally moving into our last test regimen, and we look at how that value changes things, we can have a look at AJA and how this bench test here, and ignore the big numbers at the top, we're only looking at graphs at the bottom, showed off another little factor about this SSD. Once again, we're going to bring it back into that of the, I hate seagulls, you can hear them in the background there. If we bring that down, you're able to see slight differences there on the graphs. So once again, we're looking at 1 gig versus 1 gig here, and as you can see, when it comes to the write captures, the Samsung there was a much more consistent through line. The performance was higher, it has to be said, on the WD Black there, but the caching there was improved, and a lot of that is to do with the MLC cache being used in this SSD. It helps a lot of that access time there, although overall, with fewer NAND chips being accessed at a given time, that then is seemingly recouped overall. And if you look at the performance difference between them, those write captures were overall higher on that WD as well. As we move into the final test there, we can see once again that although the performance was higher on the WD, those drops all the way through and the cache needing to be flushed was just a smoother through line and average performance on the Samsung over that WD. And a number of you who are looking at buying an SSD like this, generally if you're in the market for the Samsung 980, most of you will already have the black already in your eye line, because the two SSDs released so close together have got those similar price points and similar first party in-house architecture. Ultimately, with this SSD, if you came to this review wondering about whether the Heatsink version is worth your time, I'd say if you can get it when it's on offer, it certainly is. It's a great heatsink, and it's definitely dissipated a lot of that heat in a very, very quick fashion. There are better heatsinks out there, but the SSDs they're attached to cost a great deal more. When it comes to the SSD itself in 2022, what do I think of the performance? I think it is starting to show its age a little bit. And trying to buy this SSD, if you see it at recommended retail price, such as $229 without the heatsink or $249 with the heatsink, maybe give it a miss. But if you can see this SSD in a marketplace where it's on offer, and it's regularly on offer on the likes of Black Friday, Cyber Monday, or any of those annual deals, then do look it up. It's still a solid SSD, although it may be showing its age in 2022. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, click like. If you want to learn more about this subject as I go through even more SSDs and as we make our way into PCIe Gen 5, then do click subscribe or the bell to be notified. If you've enjoyed this video, do follow the content in the future. But if you're watching this video because you're in a bit of a bind, you're wondering what you should buy for your storage setup, for your console, your gaming, your editing, use the free advice section over on NAS Compares. It's linked in the description. It's genuinely free. It's manned by two humans, me and Eddie the web guy. We answer all of your inquiries. It's unbiased. It may take us an extra day or so to answer because we're humans with lives, but we do try to answer every single one. We don't do anything with your email. We couldn't give a stuff about your email. But if you want to donate, there's buttons there to donate, but you don't have to. I will see you on the next video.